We go, Dawn. Here we go.
Here we go. Right. Good morning. As people join, you are in the right place. You're here for the WorkBuzz webinar, and we're here today to be talking about mental health in Mental Health Awareness Week, which we are going to rename very shortly.
Do we get to see anyone else in this format, Dawn, or is it just we get to see each other?
We get to see each other.
Okay, I can live with that. I can live with that.
We'll keep doing our little dancing. Hopefully we'll get some Q&A coming through, and then as we get the questions, then we'll make sure we cover those as they come in as well.
If people want to say hello in the chat function, I guess they can. Hello, Andrea Merrill.
Yay, Andrea's here. It is rainy. We're going to bring some sunshine though, don't worry.
Hello, Ellie Maystone.
Woo. Good afternoon, Ellie. Oh, is it after? Yeah, it is afternoon. Good afternoon, Ellie. Oh, I like this. Anyone else want to say hello while we're here? This is much better because normally I do this awkward silence thing where I feel like singing at the beginning of webinars. So it's much nicer when people are saying hello.
I'd heard about your singing, Dawn, so I thought what we'd do is get people saying hello in the chat function.
That's why the attendees suddenly drop off after the first few minutes.
Yeah.
That's not very nice, Andrea. Oh dear. I have to tell you a story about Andrea. So I went to do an engagement workshop up at Orbit Group a couple of weeks ago, and I damaged my knee on the Monday night and managed to convince my mum and dad to drive me to Coventry.
No.
And Andrea was the person that kind of looked after me and made sure that on the day I was completely looked after. So yes, she
Well
kept
done,
my mental health in a good state.
Well done, Andrea.
Right, we'll give it a few more minutes and then we're going to start. So for those of you who are just joining, we're here today to talk about mental health in the workplace. Now. Still joining. Right, I think we kick off. So, welcome everyone. Really important topic that we're going to be talking about today, and it is Mental Health Awareness Week. Now, I am joined by the fabulous David Beeney, and actually saw a post by David on LinkedIn earlier this morning when he put out an impassioned plea, really, to rename Mental Health Awareness Week to Mental Health Action Week. And that really resonated with me this morning. So I thought it was a good place to start and a great way to frame what we're talking about today. So we'll do introductions in a minute and I'll introduce you to fabulous David. But you're in the right place. We're here to talk about how HR can reduce the stigma of mental health in the workplace. I think we've come a long way, but always more to do. Just some housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded today. If you've got any questions, we'd love you to interact with us. We haven't got a set agenda. It's going to be myself and David talking and seeing where it goes. So your questions will help steer kind of how the conversation evolves as well. So use the Q&A format. I'm your host, I'm Dawn. I work for WorkBuzz. So WorkBuzz is an employee listening platform. We help organizations gather real-time feedback to help improve the employee experience. So we work with some amazing companies. You can link out to our website to find out more. And feel free to join our Employee Experience Hub, where we share lots of content, courses, ebooks, all sorts on improving culture, employee experience, diversity and inclusion. So we'd love you to join us in that space. But for now, let's get cracking and let's introduce David. So David, tell us about yourself. Tell us about breaking the silence. Tell us about how today came about and what we're going to be talking about.
Thank you, Dawn. It's great to be with you this lunchtime. Yeah, I'm David Beeney. I spent 36 years working in magazines and newspapers. Not as a journalist, I was on the commercial side of things. At one stage, I was the MD of the Evening Telegraph in Northamptonshire, and I spent many years as a commercial director for Auto Trader. But throughout that 36 years, I had a big secret, a really, really big secret. And what was my secret? My secret was I was battling in private with my mental health. Even I'm surprised. I look back at my life, nobody knew about it. Nobody. I'm quite sad to admit that includes my ex-wife of 28 years, my mates down the pub, and certainly nobody I worked with knew about my battles with panic attacks and anxiety. But my life changed forever, Dawn, back in 2016 when I outed myself about my mental health. And it's proved to be one of the best things I've ever done. And certainly it's resonated, the work I do now, more with people and at a deeper level than anything I've done in my life before. The surprise I got when I outed myself was how many people shared with me that they didn't trust their employers when it came to talking honestly about mental health. And the more and more people I spoke to about my mental health, the more people shared with me that they felt by talking about mental health at work would damage their career prospects. So I made this big decision back in 2017 that where I was going to focus my energy was on helping employers to become kinder. And it's led me on a hell of a journey that I feel so lucky and privileged to do the work that I do. To give people a flavor of my work, I work with the Royal Navy. I'm helping them to get rid of their macho culture, to make it easier for sailors to be honest about their well-being. I'm not political at all, never have been, never will be, but I've ended up being the advisor to the Labour Party on creating a kinder culture within their own party. And I work with some of the biggest brands in the world. I work with Google, I work with McDonald's, I work with Samsung. And as I say, feel really, really lucky to do the work that I do. Just a few more little things about me, Dawn. I spent my entire career doing everything possible to get out of public speaking. And now I do talks like this every single day. So not surprisingly, the very first time I was doing a talk at a conference, somebody put their hand up and said, David, you seem a pretty authentic chap. If you spent all those years of doing everything possible to avoid public speaking because of panic attacks, how are you going to get through our session today without having one? And I can remember, I think I nearly had a panic attack at the question. It was such a good question. And from memory, I said two things. Firstly, I can't promise you I will, because they never go away. And secondly, there's a phrase that we associate with mental health, that it's okay not to be okay. And maybe for the first time in my life 5 years ago, I finally accepted it really is okay not to be okay. Something else that's also helped me along the way in recent years is that you inspire people when you share vulnerability. A few years ago at work, if you talked about battles with anxiety or depression, I think it was regarded as weakness, but times are changing. And these days, when you share vulnerability, it takes courage, and you're giving other people permission to share their vulnerability too. So that's another reason I get through these sessions. But I think the real reason, and I've tried to work this out myself, how I can now do this stuff is because I've accepted I'll never find a cure to my panic attacks. When you first met me, Dawn, I come across very smiley, very relaxed, very calm. A lot of that is a mask. On the inside, I'm thinking, David, please don't have a panic attack right now. They are quite uncomfortable. But I think I've realized that these days I give myself permission to have them. I've spent most of my life panicking about panic and getting anxious about anxiety. These days, when I feel the old demons returning, I say to myself, sod it, just have one. Show people right now what it looks like. I think the moment I give myself permission to have one, I reduce the chances of them happening. In our careers, we talk about raising the bar. I've been very hard on myself in my life, but I've lowered my bar. Now, that doesn't mean I've lowered my standards. That doesn't mean I've lowered my aspirations. I'm just, by not being so hard on myself, I've lowered my anxiety levels. I think I've discovered what they call the true value of self-compassion, which is all about being kinder to ourselves. And this is very early in our session today, but if we could all find a way to become kinder to ourselves, we generally improve both your well-being and your performance. That's a flavor of me, Dawn. thank you for that first question. And as I say, it is great to be with you today. Thank you.
I think your story will resonate with so many people on so many levels. And I think when we first met, then I didn't know all of that. But that vulnerability, it gives permission for other people to share their stories. And I think actually I've had a really similar journey throughout my career for different reasons, not with panic attacks, but hormones. Those pesky hormones have impacted me all the way through my life. And I've had good and horrendous experiences at work because of it. And I think I've had points where I've been told that they never want to see me showing any emotion in the workplace ever again, and almost kind of asked to hide kind of that part of me, to a place where I work now, where I know that I can completely be myself. I know that I can come here and say that I'm not having a great day, and that's okay. And there's a similar perception of me around, I'm always bubbly, I'm always smiley, you know, it's always kind of Dawn's the positive one. But it's not humanly possible to be like that all the time. And so I've got really good at putting a mask on as well. And I think as I get older, I become kinder to myself, and I enable other people to open up about those things as well. And I think your story absolutely resonates with me for that very same reason. And I think the more we talk about things, the more open other people can be. Do you think the pandemic has changed that in terms of, are people having more conversations from your perspective?
I think it has helped to some degree. I think it's got more acceptable to admit that you're not feeling okay. But let's not kid ourselves. The stigma of mental health is still very much alive and kicking. There is so much more work to be done. I see organizations sometimes patting themselves on the back thinking, well, we've dealt with mental health. We've got ourselves 10 mental health first aiders. And we got that guy in called David Beeney to do a talk during National Mental Health Awareness Week. So we dealt with mental health in the workplace. But unless you change culture at the top of your organization, and so much of my work is about culture, nothing changes. The Royal Navy wouldn't mind me saying, you can have the best resource in the world available to your employees. So from an HR perspective, you could have the best employee assistance program that's out there. As I say, you could have teams of mental health first aiders. But unless you create a culture where people feel safe to be honest and open about their well-being, then nothing changes. So yes, we have made progress, Dawn. There is more talk about mental health these days, but as I said on that post on LinkedIn this morning, there's a lot of awareness about mental health now, which is why we call it Mental Health Awareness Week. But still too many companies are not really walking the talk. They're not taking really positive action to really make it easier for every single person who works for them to put their hand up and say, I'm not in a good place today, I'm struggling. So yes, progress has been made, but a lot more work to be done. Thank you.
In your experience, where's the best place to start?
There's only one place to start, and it has to be at the top. It has to be at the very top of the organization. Sadly, too many companies are still ticking a box when it comes to mental health. The great news is, and let's be positive about this, there's many more organizations are giving very regular evidence from the very top of their businesses that they are making well-being one of their strategic priorities. I couldn't make this up. I'm sitting in a business in Hemel Hempstead at the moment called Vanarama, and their CEO, a guy called Andy Alderson, he's one of my favorite examples of a senior leader who sets the tone from the very top of his organization. At the very start of the pandemic, so over 2 years ago now, none of us knew what was going to happen. People were very, very nervous about where this pandemic was leading us. Now, Vanarama is a very salesy company. It employs lots of young people. And it's, you know, I could open the door now and you'd hear sell, sell, sell. Well, right at the start of the pandemic, Andy sent out a video message to all staff, which went a little bit like this. He said, at the moment, I don't care about sales. I care about you, my people, and your families. He said, my priority over the coming months is going to be to make sure we've got a great business at the end of this that we're all still really proud to work for. So let me say it again, he said, at the moment, I don't care about sales. Well, guess what happened? Sales went up. His people were so inspired by his authenticity that they wanted to work even harder for the organization. Does Andy care about sales? Of course he does. He's put his life into this business, but he also genuinely cares about his people, and his staff know that. So that's a classic, a really good example of a CEO making well-being one of their absolute priorities in the business and then seeing the benefits of it. Sadly, in reverse to that, Dawn, I turn up with some businesses and I might do a talk to 50, 60 staff, but there'll be no senior management in the room because they're too busy, because they haven't found the time to give up an hour to show the rest of the staff that I'm giving up an hour because this topic's really important to me. So your question was, where does it start? It has to start at the very top, because culture comes top down. And unless senior leaders change their behavior and role model this, then nothing's going to change further down the line. So that's where it has to start.
Oh, and I think I mentioned at the beginning that I've experienced both sides as well. And actually, Steve, our CEO, is a really good example of that coming from the top at WorkBuzz. So he gave out a really similar message at the beginning of the pandemic. But more recently, from a personal perspective for me, I had a really horrible experience happen for my daughter, actually, and one of her friends at 13 took her own life. And I had a big pitch to do. I'm going to get emotional now, but I had a big pitch to do on the Monday morning at 10 o'clock. And as I walked in through the door, I was literally on the floor in tears. Oh God, I am going to cry. Not knowing if I could actually kind of make it through the day at work. And it's the perfect example of Steve knowing exactly what to do, because he sat with me. There was no talk of the presentation that we were needing to do in the next kind of 45 minutes. He literally sat with me, talked to me, and showed absolute care. And because of that, we went ahead, we did the pitch, it went really well. And we came out of it, and I went home and kind of was surrounded with support. But that experience could have been very different. That experience could have been a lot more stressful. And what came out of that, just for us as a team, was sharing that vulnerability. Just led, thank you, Ellie. Just led to just a stronger connection between us, people more willing to share their own stories. It was incredible, kind of the amount of love and support that I felt over the following weeks. And I think this is the difference, isn't it? It's kind of, when it comes down to well-being, it's about working for an organisation that cares about you and genuinely cares about you at the time that it matters the most.
Yeah.
Might breathe a minute.
Just to say, Dawn, as well, yes, it has to come down from the very top, but equally, all people managers play a part in culture as well, because often what you think of your manager is what you think of the organisation. And forgive my language here, but we've all had a shit manager in our careers, and we know what that feels like. You can work for a brilliant organization with a great culture, but if your own manager doesn't get it, you don't get that experience. So one of the key things every business has to do, in my opinion, is educate and train managers on the power of how are you. And what I mean by that is that it's so evidence-based now that we need to be starting meetings at work, whether it's a team meeting or a one-to-one, before we start talking about work, asking people how they are. And it has to come from here, which is why I put my hand here. And you've got to be prepared to listen. As I say, that is evidence-based, that when we get that right, it's the simplest and easiest way to create a culture where people feel cared for. Insight that I'm allowed to share, Dawn, actually comes from the bank HSBC, who are considered one of the best employers in the world. But they carried out a survey. At the time, it was the biggest ever wellbeing survey undertaken of 76,000 staff. And they asked them lots of questions about wellbeing, but one question was very black and white. And it simply said, do we care about you, yes or no? And obviously that they put that question in because they thought most people would say yes, but 38,000 staff said no. 50% of their workforce said, you don't care about me. Now they drilled into the data because they're brilliant with their data analytics, and they went looking for common denominators, and they found it straight away. The common denominator was your boss, was your line manager. And then they drilled further into the data to see what do managers do to make you think we don't care about you. And number one was those managers always talked about customers, KPIs, sales, as opposed to saying, how are you? How are you doing? So management training as well in creating the right sort of culture is so important, so important. Thank you. Thank you, Dawn.
I think last time that we chatted before, when we were planning this a little bit, we talked about appreciation, didn't we? And we talked about relationships and how sometimes kind of, I explained that my previous job title was an appreciatologist, and how the worst piece of feedback that I'd ever had from my husband was the fact that he didn't feel appreciated. I was like the biggest hypocrite of all time. But it is going back to that story around HSBC, isn't it? It's about taking the time to notice what people do on a personal level, what matters to them, and say thank you. Because when we do that, we show that we care, we show that we're listening, we show that we know what matters to them, and we're taking the time to really allow them to share that with us.
I saw a brilliant Japanese CEO do a talk at a very academic institute, probably about 20 years ago. And his talk was all about how do you run an incredibly successful business. And at the end of his talk, he was asked to leave us all with a golden nugget, one golden nugget to take away as to how you run a brilliant business. And I always remember he said that he had 8 direct reports. He tried to speak to all of them at least every other day, but only half of those conversations might be about work. And then he sat down. And I looked around the room that day, and many people looked hugely disappointed at this golden nugget, because in effect, his number one advice to all of these business leaders was that half your conversations at work don't need to be about work. Now, that was about 20 years ago. He was incredibly successful, and I think he was ahead of his time. Because 20 years later, I truly get what he was saying now. But there's still many, many leaders who don't get the importance of having conversations at work that are not about work.
Yeah.
One of my best ever bosses, a lady called Sharon Randall, when I was at Auto Trader, Sharon came up to me one day and said to me, David, how's Sally's dog? And I started laughing. And Sharon said, what's funny about that question? And I said, well, why would I ask Sally about her dog when I didn't even know Sally had a dog? And Sharon didn't even smile and said to me, I'm disappointed. You should know Sally's got a dog because her dog is her life. Next time you see Sally, please ask her about her dog. So I did do. And when I look back at my relationship with Sally, she became a real advocate of mine. We had a fantastic working relationship, but it only really changed for the better the day I asked her about her dog, because at that point we connected on a more humanistic level. And it's simple stuff like that that makes a really, really big difference. One more quick story. As you know, I love a story. A very alpha male senior leader got in contact with me recently and said to me, I'm going to tell you a true story that you can share in your workshops and talks. He said that there's been a lady who's worked for him for a few years who's always very nervous around him. And she came up to him a couple of weeks ago, being her normal timid self. And he always senses that she wants to get away from him as quickly as possible. And while they were talking, he remembered overhearing a conversation that she'd recently taken a day off to help her son settle back at university. So while she was talking, he said to her, oh, by the way, how's your son getting on back at university? And he said for the first time in 2 years, this person relaxed in front of him. They became a different person. Now he was going that way to the canteen to make himself a coffee. She would normally go that way. She came with him to the canteen and they sat down and they had a coffee together. And over the last couple of weeks, he's seen a different person. She's been an even better employee, wanting to work even harder for him than she previously did. And she's always been a good employee. Now, the reason he told me that story was he had an admission. And his admission is he now believes that at that moment when he said to her, oh, by the way, how is your son settling on back at university? That was the first time in 2 years that he'd spoken to her about anything other than work. And that turned out to be the key to unlock their relationship, a key that is now making her work even harder for him, because eventually he had a conversation with her that was nothing to do with work. And I think that's quite powerful, Dawn. I think that's quite powerful.
Well, and one of the bullets that we had in terms of the webinar today was around what can HR do to encourage positive conversations around mental health. That's it right there, that nugget, isn't it? It's around how do you enable people leaders across your organizations to have the time to have those conversations, to get to know their people better, because that's it. You build trust, you create an environment where psychological safety exists, you allow people to be themselves, and you encourage a workplace where people are good talking about whatever's going on, you know, not just the work KPIs, to your point.
Yeah, and I'll say something, I don't mean it to sound controversial, but I think one of the ways HR can improve conversations around mental health in businesses is to get rid of the word mental. People don't like it. Part of the stigma is the word mental. If you put into Google Images mental health, it's all negative imagery, pictures of someone like me with their head in their hands looking really sad. If we talk about healthier minds and health and well-being, we generally get more engagement on this topic. Often HR people say to me, how, David, do you engage senior teams who aren't particularly interested in fluffy subjects that they would deem fluffy, like mental health and well-being? And I think we need to change the language we use around this topic. Another piece of insight I can share with you, or a story I can share with you, I'm allowed to share, comes from the travel company TUI. I was lucky enough a few years ago to do a presentation to their board at their head office in Luton. And the managing director, I knew that he was worried about getting buy-in from some of the senior people on this topic, because they didn't necessarily want me on the agenda at all. So what he chose to do was he put me down on the agenda as driving energy through TUI. And when he introduced me that day, he said, I'm going to make no apologies. If I'd have put David Beeney on the agenda as the mental health guy or well-being, some of you wouldn't have turned up today. And if you had have turned up, you may not have turned up with the right mindset. But he said, I make no apologies. I put David down as driving energy through TUI, because I honestly think if we get our approach to well-being right, we will drive energy across this organization. And I think you all realize if you drive energy through an organization, you're going to drive performance as well. And perhaps then some of you will realize this isn't a fluffy topic. This is about getting the very best out of our people and making our managers better at their jobs. So yeah, I think we need to get rid of that word mental. Thanks, Dawn.
I think one of the things that you've got me thinking about is, why is it so hard, within senior leadership populations? Andrea's just messaged actually and said, when leaders can show up as their authentic selves as well, and when they're sharing stories, that builds connection as well. It's that vulnerability piece, isn't it? Is that what stops people doing it? And then I was thinking about, the power of how are you? That needs to go always, doesn't it? It's not a top, everyone asking, down the hierarchy of an organization. It's asking up, it's asking left, it's asking right. It's basically not being discriminate about asking who, we ask everyone how they are, not all at once. But this is what we need to get past, isn't it?
Absolutely. I can remember talking to someone very senior in the Royal Navy at dinner about 3 years ago, and he shared with me privately his what he described as a mental health breakdown. And at the time, he told me the lengths that the Navy went to, and he went to hide it from everybody. Well, about 6 months ago, I had the privilege of sharing a stage with him when he spoke to hundreds and hundreds of sailors about his mental health breakdown. There was grown people crying. It was very emotional. And he never thought he'd talk about it in his career. Is he now seen as weak? Is he now seen as a liability? Not at all. He's now seen as a more courageous leader than ever, because he's been prepared to talk about his mental health. And it is evidence-based on that even a CEO is more likely to lose their job in the boardroom these days when they don't show vulnerability. Because to coin a sporting phrase, when you're more authentic and you show vulnerability, you're more likely to take the dressing room with you. I was running a workshop last week, and I was talking about a good way to check in with people is get them to give you a score out of 10 for how they're feeling. And a manager spoke up and said that, I don't know why she used number 4, but she said, oh, I could never admit to my team if I was 4 out of 10 one day. And luckily for me, other people on the workshop all said to her, why not? Why couldn't you admit you're having a tough day to your team? And but at first she struggled to get her head around it, because she's clearly been a manager throughout her life that thinks that every day at work you've got to be Superman or Superwoman. Even this morning, so this is a story from this morning. Someone emailed me after a webinar this morning, and I asked people in the chat function to give me scores from 1 to 10. And at first, what always happens is, Dawn, people put the safe numbers of 8 and 7. Then someone will put a 6, which then means other people think, oh, it's okay to say you're under 7. And then someone will put a 5. And this person emailed me literally in the last hour saying, when you first asked for that number, I put a 5 because I didn't dare put any lower number than that. And she said, when someone else put a 5, I then changed my number to a 4. But she said, the reality is I'm a 1. But I couldn't tell anyone that in my own organization. So when I finish this session today, because I've heard that she's 1 out of 10, I've got a duty of care to contact them and say, look, please, can we talk? Because 1 out of 10 is a very, very concerning number. Thanks, Dawn.
And I've seen that exercise play out in teams that I've been in as well. And what's been really lovely to see when lower scores have come through is how willing everyone is to chip in and ask what they can do to support and help. And, and it's a lovely, we're talking about kinder cultures, aren't we? That type of question at the beginning of a meeting is actually a great temperature check of where people are to steer the rest of the meeting, to steer the rest of the conversation, isn't it? Because it's like, okay, how do we split resource? How do we make sure that you've got enough support based on where you are right now?
Yeah.
And
I've had many people understand me in the last 2 years, Dawn, say to me, but David, now we're working remotely and hybrid. It's not as easy to keep an eye on my people because it's not the same as being in the office every day. And of course I accept that. However, there are things that we can do when people are working remotely and virtually to keep an eye on them. Two things spring to mind. Firstly, in the last 2 years, working on video calls like this one today, I've met more cats and dogs, I've met more partners, I've met more kids than in the past 40 years. And why is that important? It's important, again, because it's enabled me to have human connection with people, which means that when you have that deeper, more meaningful connection, people are more likely to open up to you and tell you when they're struggling. But one other story for you that, again, just relates back to the last few weeks. A few weeks ago, I was running a webinar, and it had about 100 people on it. And it was a very standard webinar. Of the 100 people, probably 20 people had their cameras on. And it wasn't like today, quite an interactive session. I basically was delivering a talk. So it was just me talking to 100 people virtually for nearly an hour. And at the end of the session, the HR director contacted me and said, thanks for today. I said, yeah, it seemed to go quite well. I said, but there's 3 people on that session today I'm a little bit concerned about. And the HR director said to me, hang on, David, you've just done, sitting in your own house, a webinar for 100 people. 80 of them probably didn't have their cameras on, yet you're giving me the names of 3 people on that session that you're a bit concerned about. How can you possibly know that there was 3 people out there who might not be in a good place? And I said to them, look, I said, as you know, I asked everyone in the chat function to give me a score from 1 to 10 for how they're feeling today in terms of energy. And those 3 people all scored 2 or less. So maybe they've got a good reason for that, but I think it's worth just contacting them to say, look, David noticed your score was very low. Is everything okay? So we just have to think about different ways of coaching people to check in with people. It's
such simple stuff, really, isn't it? And it's just
it
almost just stopping for a second and just thinking about those times when we could just do something as simple as that. So powerful.
It's like I work with many diverse cultures, and some businesses, they almost encourage people not to have their cameras on. Now, I know it sounds very flippant, but you wouldn't go to a meeting at work with a box on your head because, you know, you didn't want people to see you on that day. I also accept, in this busy, crazy world we work in now, that sometimes people see a webinar as an opportunity to carry on doing some other work. I get that. I do live in the real world. But if we're going to keep an eye on our people, if this is all about human connection, where possible, we should have cameras on. I know it's not always possible to have your camera on, sometimes for technical reasons, sometimes because of where you are. But overall, we should encourage cameras on, because it's a way to keep an eye on people. I'm not a big fan of those corporate backdrops either. Yes, again, I respect some people don't want people to see behind them, and there's good reasons for that. But in many cases, it's good to see a cat. It's good to see an interesting picture on the wall, because you're relating more to that person in a more humanistic way again.
And there's lots of research out there, isn't there, around the increase in loneliness on the back of the pandemic. But I think it's always been there. But I think if you don't have your camera on as well, just that inability to look at someone, to see someone, you know, the bit that I missed the most during the pandemic, being approximately 98% extroverted and getting my energy from people, was the fact that, you know, you're not having meaningful conversation with people. That's what I love the most. It's actually having a proper, deep and meaningful, having an informal chat as you kind of come into the office, or you go and get a coffee or whatever it is. And on Zoom or Teams or whatever we use, very efficient. You've got half an hour, you get on the call, you do what you need to do, you jump off. And there's less of that spontaneous kind of conversation where you spend the time getting to know people, having a chit chat, all that kind of stuff. And with your camera off, you're less likely to do that as well, because you're almost seeing it as a signal that that person doesn't want to engage with you as much. So there's some psychological stuff going on there as well. And I just miss looking in the whites of someone's eyes and going, hey, how you doing? So I think, you know, that technology absolutely has its place, and it's enabled us to stay connected, but not in a meaningful way. And I think that's the gap, isn't it? That's what we're missing. It's the meaningful connection piece.
And I think what we've learned over the last couple of years about working from home, it may be not as good for your mental health as people first thought at the beginning.
Yeah.
When some of us first started working from home, we thought, this is really good because I've got rid of a 2-hour commute, and I've got more time to spend with the family and the kids. And don't get me wrong, for some people it is amazing, and it has really, really worked for them. But most HR surveys indicate that we do longer hours at home with less breaks. And I think we've all started to realize how much we miss the physical energy we get when you're with people in an office or a laboratory or a factory floor. And we've also realized the commute separated work from home and was like our me time. It was a chance to listen to some music, to switch off, to ring a couple of mates up. So many people are now, they're using words they never thought they'd hear themselves say. They miss their commute because it separated work from home and gave them a chance to ring up some pals. So really important that we find ways people are working in the new hybrid way to protect their mental health, without a doubt. Thanks, Dawn.
A podcast that I listened to this morning, actually, when I was dog walking, which it touches on quite a few things that we've talked about. I'm a big fan of Brené Brown, and she has one of the most popular TED Talks on the power of vulnerability, which is worth a watch. But I was listening to a podcast on her Dare to Lead series this morning with a guy called Scott Sonnenschein. He's just written a book called The Joy of Work.
I've heard of them. Yeah.
And they were talking about the fact that actually going into the office gives you a routine. It gives you a structure to the day. And actually with the pandemic, that disappeared as well. And actually from when we're thinking about our mental health or the energy that we get in the day, a lot of that comes from knowing what we're doing. It's the predictability of a day and being able to plan that out. And I think when you're working from home or you're doing hybrid, or you kind of, it's very, very inconsistent, isn't it? And And that's causing kind of additional stress that we didn't have before. And there's so much uncertainty around as well that actually we're missing that structure. And that's the battle with hybrid as well. And that's why I think it sounds good, but actually it has to be based on what we're doing, and it has to be quite task focused. So absolutely, if you want to be in the office to collaborate, to generate ideas, to give feedback even, that's always better in person. But actually, when you head down in the data or doing stuff where you just need some peace and quiet, it's best to do it from home. But all of this needs to be really intentional, doesn't it, in terms of how we design our workplaces moving forward, and to be able to keep listening to our employees to make sure that we're doing the right things and then pivot if we need to.
I think we're having to be more flexible in our approach than we've ever been before, because if you said, Dawn, yep, can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, you just froze.
All right, okay. Yeah, we're having to be more flexible with our thinking than ever before, because for some employees, it does really work so well for them working from home. Other people just want to get back to the office every day. And then you've got all those people somewhere in the middle. So we're trying to find ways that work for everybody, whilst at the same time thinking about the overall team culture. Some of the very best days in my life, Dawn, were the early days of my career of the relationships I formed at work, and the banter and the fun and the camaraderie. And if we're always going to work from home now and never go to offices again, I do worry about young people, particularly in their early careers, not forming relationships in the same way we would have done years ago by working in busy offices every day. But it's a difficult one to get right, because you're never going to please everyone all the time. And we're going to have to be more flexible in our thinking as employers than we've ever been before. Thanks, Dawn.
Agreed. One question, I'm just conscious of time now, but Andrea asked, what was the catalyst for David to be open about his mental health back in 2016?
For a man who loves a story, this is not a great story. I qualified to be a mental health counsellor about 12 years ago now, probably. And I was still working at Auto Trader back in 2016. And I bumped into someone in HR, and they literally said, hang on, David, don't you know a bit about mental health? I said, yeah. And they said, well, in a few weeks' time, it's Mental Health Awareness Week. And they said, in the past, we've got someone in from outside to do some talks. Why don't you do them? I'm sure people would love to hear from you, your thoughts about mental health. And I hoped it would go away. I really didn't want to do it. But a few days later, I got an email saying, David, thank you for agreeing to do these talks in London and Manchester. Please, can you send me your slides? I'm interested to see what you're going to talk about. And I thought, what slides? I'm interested what I'm going to talk about as well, because I didn't know what to do. And then I thought one night at home, I thought, sod it, I'll talk about me. I'll share my own personal story about hiding my mental health for so many years. Now, what I'll be honest with you about is that I was leaving Auto Trader in September of that year. And many people have said to me, if you hadn't been leaving, but were currently applying for an even bigger job within Auto Trader, would you have outed yourself about mental health? And the truth is, I'll never know the answer to that question. But that's what changed my life. It was HR. I think they saw a way of saving money by getting me to do some talks rather than pay someone to come in from outside. But I'm so glad they did, because it's been life-changing. Good question.
So we get to have you here today. So if you could leave us with one message today, what would it be?
I'm probably going to be greedy and go for two, Dawn.
We'll allow that.
I think I talked earlier on my discovery of self-compassion, which is about being kinder to ourselves. So I'd want everyone who listens to this session today, and he's listening to me now, find a way to become kinder to yourself, because that will mean different things to each of you. But when you become kinder to yourself, you'll generally always improve your mental well-being and your performance as well. And the other message, in terms of looking after people in workplaces, I'd go back to the power of how are you? I would try and start as many conversations as you can with work colleagues in meetings, in one-to-ones, by saying, look, I know we're busy, but how are you? And ask from here, be prepared to listen, and maybe perhaps share a little bit about yourself as well at the same time. those would be the two things I'd like to leave everybody with. And obviously, thank you again, Dawn. You know, we've only met a few times, but you're a real pleasure to be with. And so thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you today. Been a real pleasure. Thank you.
I've loved it, and I'm feeling quite emotional on the back of it, to be honest. But a massive thank you to everyone for joining. As we said, we'll be sharing the webinar, so feel free to share it on with anyone else. But I think the two messages that David has left us with are really powerful ones, both from a personal perspective and the things that are very easy to do in our everyday working lives. So a massive thank you, David. We'll be in touch, no doubt. But it's been emotional.
Thank you,
all right,
Dawn.
have a great day.
Right, see you
Take care,
soon.
everyone.
Take care. Bye. Bye.